programming of the Recollection lecture, Recollection series lectures, and we have a Trinity term card pick up on the way out that lists this and other things that are happening. And if I could draw your attention briefly at the start to what's happening in a few weeks' time, when we'll have Professor Alistair McGrath speaking about Albert Einstein on science and God. And then Christina Rossetti, who is a Puseyite, Rebecca Vince, a former intern and at Pusey House, will be speaking on Christina Rossetti, the poet, and the reflections of Revelation. And finally, Cardinal Ludwig Müller will be speaking about Cardinal Newman, someone he's written about in German in his role as an academic theologian. That being said, I should briefly say, people have told me I get up here and I don't tell you who I am, you know? That's usually just me forgetting about myself for that one moment of the day I forget about myself. So I'm the lay academic fellow here, and along with Father Mark and Father George Westhaver, we form the chapter of Pusey House, and we try to make all of these things available to you with the great help of our greater chapter, which includes persons, Father James, Jack Chisnall, and others. And Pusey House is run by a very small group of very select people. And one of the things we try to offer is sacred learning, and have since the 19th century when this was founded, when just after this desk, which was Pusey's desk when he was in Christ Church, ceased to be used by him, and the Anglo-Catholic movement was seeking to have a home within the Church of England. This house became an informal chaplaincy to the university, and I've been brought in to kind of consolidate our sacred learning and to make it as good as it can be within an idiom that's recognizably Christian and within the Anglo-Catholic tradition. That being said, we also tolerate people from the evangelical side, even liberal Democrats, as it were, yes. And David Campanale has clearly been here before, as he managed to pilfer a tie last time he was here. But he and I have known one another for a few years and have become fast friends because he's a very good man and has a clear mind. And we also noticed a fellow shared spirit, right? Sometimes you meet someone, you know that person shares a phronema or the same spirit with you, and I noticed that every time we see one another again. And but we're not here to talk about our friendship. We're here to talk about keeping faith in the media. David Campanale was until very recently a multi-award-winning editor at the BBC. He broke many stories, but one that you probably have all heard of, and we're very glad he broke through his connections to Christians in China, was the story on the persecution of the Uyghurs and the attempted, the genocidal relation to the Uyghurs in China. And if you talk to him later, he can tell you about all kinds of other fascinating things he's done and how it works inside the BBC and how he managed to survive so many years and not be thrown out, but to show himself out to bigger and better things. He's currently campaigning for a position for the Liberal Democrats in London, which is in which
Sutton Chin.
And we hope you will vote for him, or maybe buy votes for him or something like that. Is that still done? Is that still done? No. No, I should stop then.
This isn't America.
It's more American than it was, though. You know. So without further ado, he will give us a talk, some of which we've heard bits and pieces of before in other contexts, on the BBC as a covenanted institution within the English establishment. Yeah.
Do what you need to do.
Yeah. Great. So without further ado, I present Mr. David Campanale.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction, thank you. So I'm going to be, I suppose I should say a few things at the beginning. I was working for the television arm of BBC, the World Service or Global News up until the 31st of December. I began my journalism in Lviv for BBC Newsnight in 1989, and my career for ITN in the summer of '89 inside Ceausescu's Romania. And I spent most of my career in the television arm of the BBC World Service. where I wasn't an editor. That's quite an esteemed position. I was a journalist, reporter, producer on the desk, so was never posted abroad, but did most of my work from the newsroom in New Broadcasting House. And I was the leader of the National Union of Journalists for a period of time in London, in the London branch of the NUJ, and sat on the National Executive. So my talk today is looking at how institutions in the UK were shaped, how they emerged, how we understand the contribution that they've made to the body politic. And I've decided to talk about faith in the media by the lens of John Reith's Presbyterianism, so the Calvinism of the founding Director General of the BBC, John Reith. And my interest was particularly prompted a couple of years ago at the carol service before lockdown, where Lord Hall of Birkenhead, the Director General of the BBC, gave this following Bible reading. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy and you've promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, Sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing, the house of your servant will be blessed forever. So I was particularly, you very rarely hear that reading in a carol service. It was unusual, but I thought it was particularly revealing because just before that, Boris Johnson had made plain his threat to the direction of the BBC. This was just before the COVID pandemic. And within weeks of Lord Hall giving that reading, the Director of News, employs thousands of journalists. Fran Unsworth, she held a gathering and I was present, in which she announced that 450 journalistic posts were going to close, there would be redundancies, and she said, and I quote directly, "Never in my career have I felt this organisation under threat as the way it is today." She's left the BBC, I've left the BBC. I think the Times a few weeks ago estimated that 1,000 years of experience in the newsroom have left the BBC. The BBC is in chaos, and I'm regularly sort of told about that by former colleagues in the union, who literally sort of update me because I'm included in various WhatsApp groups, as you can imagine. And last week, the newspapers reported that the BBC is going to cut even more jobs as it needs to find yet further savings. The reason that is that the BBC licence fee, so the primary source of income, has been frozen for another 2 years. Inflation's at sort of 7, 8, 9%, very possibly 10%. That inflation is marked in production costs. So the effect of inflation, the effect of a frozen licence fee is that the BBC's primary income source is diminished, and therefore yet more jobs will have to be cut, and the Times signalled that just again last week. So what I'm going to do in this talk today is to use various analytical tools to assess the 100-year anniversary of the BBC after its founding. It's primarily I'm going to use allegory, conjecture, all the things that I was told not to do as a journalist, i.e. to project my interpretation onto the facts. So I'm not a scholar, but I do think that everything I'm about to say is anchored in reality, just not reality as you might understand it in the world that defines reality very differently from a Christian perspective. So I'm a Christian, but I'm also primarily a journalist. So I'm interested in what it is that makes people act in certain kinds of ways. So what is it that they're doing when they go about doing things? So I'm interested in evaluating that, interpreting it, and faithfully reporting what motivates people to do actions in the world. Reith literally believed that things could happen on earth as they happen in heaven. So he took the Lord's Prayer, if you like, literally. This talk, however, is essentially a work of imagination. So it's not often that you hear Samuel quoted, but Reith, if he'd heard that talk, his ears would have pricked up if he'd been present. He was the very first manager when the BBC was established as the broadcasting company in 1922, and he was its first Director General when it became a public corporation in 1927. So if alive today, I think Reith would have observed that our failing modern institutions are failing institutions reflect a lack of trust in the body politic. Reith thought it possible to discern God at work in the world, according essentially to covenant promises. So he evaluated what he did by promises and the consequences of breaking promises. And here's a great quote from a former oil executive. A key mark of decline in a wide range of institutions or movements is the massive capacity for analysis of problems, but no capacity to treat the problems identified. So one of the things that journalists are very good at doing is saying how terrible the world is, reporting faithfully that it can be pretty bleak. I can say that having been on the news desk for a quarter of a century, I've pretty much seen it all. We're forever trying to work out how many horses of the apocalypse are riding at the same time. If it's not death, it's pestilence, etc., etc. So it's pretty bleak. The challenge, though, is to narrate a way or an answer to understand the world that gives the possibility of some kind of transformation and hope. The very fact I've quoted from Welby indicates that some of those solutions can be seen from the Christian worldview. And so what is it that Welby and others have discerned? Essentially, it's poor governance, lack of accountability, regulation that's been found wanting, insufficient boundaries, the connivance of those in authority who should have known better. Today, that is just as applicable with our government, and some might say the BBC, as pretty much any time in the last 15, 20 years and further back. So my observation is that the systems of governance of public bodies in the early part of the 20th century, when the BBC was founded, didn't emerge in some kind of vacuum. It wasn't some kind of moral or ethical or spiritual whole. Christianity at that time shaped the public purpose of the new institutions that came about. And they anchored the vocation of their leaders, including Reith. So through his life, he expressed the view that he was acting in some sense providentially to fulfill a higher purpose. Much of what I'm describing to you can be read in Ian McIntyre's good biography, The Expense of Glory, The Life of John Reith. And in that, he wrote the following on page 39. In his own religious observance, Reith was punctilious. He read his Bible every evening, and night and morning read a small devotional book called Daily Light, which he had from his mother when he was small, end quotes. So as a Scottish Presbyterian, Reith's father was a minister in the Church of Scotland. He spoke in support of the ideals of what we are familiar with as the Scottish Covenanters. Drawing on his upbringing in the manse, Reith would have understood that God's salvation purpose goes beyond individuals. There's a very individualistic tone to modern day Protestantism. But that isn't the whole story of the Reformed tradition, which sees that God's salvation extends through dynasties, nations, and institutions. And he allowed for himself the possibility that institutions could enter a covenant with God. The person who's writing, or who has written, I think, the best about this in the last 30 years, but more than that, is Oliver O'Donovan. And much of the approach that I'm taking, the lens, if you like, of my interpretation, comes from his book, The Desire of the Nations. And if you want to know more about how covenanting could be applied in other spheres of society, it's well worth dipping into that. So what about going back to Reith? In 1937, a director of the BBC's Scottish region called Cleghorn Thompson, he assessed John Reith as a, quote, covenanting idealist, a praise God barebones dwelling on chill Olympian heights of motive, resolved to uplift the groundlings. A covenanting idealist. But it has to be said that Reith was a deeply flawed character. A bully, some say he was a bit of a monster. He liked Mussolini, for example. However, today, if you describe what are known as Reithian values, everyone in the media still today understands what you're talking about. Ideas of public purpose, ideas of that there are values that can be shared and upheld and celebrated. So going back to that opening Bible reading, we understand that the house that Lord Hall referred to is about the dynastic line of King David, so fulfilled in the son of David, Jesus. But the passage also touches on another house, the temple that David's son Solomon would go on to build so that God would dwell upon the earth. That idea of heaven, if you like, coming onto earth, present in the temple. So that you can see already this allegory. Clearly whoever chose that Bible reading for the BBC Carol service was intimating that posterity matters, that covenant is part of the story, and that the house, BBC Broadcasting House, new broadcasting house, that there is another house that is worth talking about. And in the mind of covenanting Calvinists like Reith, whether a house endures for posterity is conditional. It's linked to the honour and worship of God, so the acknowledgement of who's boss. So the Reformed theology of Reith suggests that every institution and nation should acknowledge Christ, for this is plain in Pauline teaching. Pick up on Philippians chapter 2, 10 to 11. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So the concept for Reith, and when he fought in the First World War, when he was commanding his company, he insisted that the gospel would be shared with the troops before they went over the top to enter into no man's land. So he would lead Scottish background. They would have been almost certainly Presbyterian by birth, but for those who hadn't confessed their sins or hadn't made peace with God, for him that idea that you better bow the knee now because in 30 minutes time you might be find yourself before your maker. So Reith took his theological background and perspective very seriously. So next slide. These are some of the questions that we're talking about in terms of lack of trust. I made this slide some months ago. My goodness, it's still just as relevant, is it not? So to illustrate this idea of growing distrust. And Reith wrote to Sir Arthur Ford, again quoted in his biography in 1964. He felt the BBC had in some sense lost its connection with its anchor. The BBC's lost dignity and repute, he wrote, in the upper reaches of intellectual and ethical and social leadership. It's abdicated its responsibility and its privilege. Its influence is disruptive and subversive. It's no longer on the Lord's side. I'm sorry, and this is pretty condemning stuff, I'm sorry I ever had anything to do with it, he wrote. So he was ambiguous, spiritual, flawed, but he was trying to apply theology to the real world. And in this space between the now and still to come, that's rooted in Christian ideas of the rule of Christ. So Jesus is Lord, but his lordship is still being established and will one day be completely present. And he felt that it was justifiable to apply those ideas to the BBC. And I believe if he was alive today, he would have a lot more to say about the BBC and how it's governed and its founding values, and more on that later. So essentially, the same kind of criticisms you might place. I made a documentary for BBC One about 25 years ago in the Everyman series called Vote, Vote, Vote for the Almighty, that applied some of these ideas to the English Constitution, because some of the parallel Christian narrative, the idea of a covenanted nation, were essential to are essential to our understanding of Britain even today and its constitution. And you might want to apply some of this kind of analytical tools to understanding Britain today. Here we go. So what was it that motivated Reith? How did he get into the business of broadcasting? So he felt very strongly that he was called to serve, and that it was a particular direction that he had as part of his Christian vocation. And he began as an engineer, and he had a remarkable sense that God had destined him for the work of creating a broadcasting service. And going back to that biography on page 116, McIntyre writes from Reith's diary, he was at a Scottish church in West London. By the way, one of the BBC's editors who you see on the television very regularly is an elder at this same church. And he wrote this: "Perhaps the minister said there was someone in the church that very night who would save the country from heathendom, immorality, and love of money." Reith returned to the Cavendish in his diary. "I still believe there is some high work for me in the world." The next morning, Reith's eyes was caught by an advertisement in the public appointments section of the Morning Post, which he liked to read at breakfast. "The BBC information, applications are invited," and he then posted his application for the general managership. What was interesting is that after he was invited to interview, the previous night, his diary says, Reith had put all before God. But that, however, was the limit of his preparation. He wrote, "The fact is, I hadn't the remotest idea as to what broadcasting was. I hadn't troubled to find out." He was offered the job the very next day, which of course confirmed his perceptions. So he founded the BBC in 1922, and the first public TV service in the world began in 1936. Its reach is enormous, and it's still one of Britain's best known global brands. And he was adamant that the BBC should be free from the state and free from the profit motive. He believed, and the history of the BBC explains this, that it should be independent of the commercial imperative. He didn't want that to be a factor, if you like, on taking decisions about the direction of the corporation. And his views were that the airwaves were a national asset to be owned and operated by the nation for the nation. And he wasn't going to serve mammon. It was set up by Royal Charter for 10 years, it was presented to the Commons, and he wrote, in that period, he noted in his diary, "I'm profoundly thankful to God in this matter. It's all his doing," he wrote. And the BBC has now flourished, and we get, 500 million people listening globally. I should stop saying wigs, because I no longer work for the BBC. But it does belong to all of us, so I think we can all say that the BBC in some sense belongs to the people, as we pay the licence fee, or at least you should do, if you're watching the news or using your TV set. So the BBC has flourished, and it's still resonant to talk about its values. And when he met the Conservative Prime Minister at that time, Baldwin, at dinner, he wrote again in his diary that he spoke seriously about social purpose and common sense Christian ethics. The supply of good things, he said, created the demand for more. He ventured to believe that a new national asset had been created, and that down the years it would bring the compound interest of happier homes, broader culture, and truer citizenship. So all founded, if you like, in his Christian worldview, and he therefore sensed that the BBC had some covenant, if he made a promise to God, and that God's purpose would in some sense be used through the servanty, or the servant nature of the corporation. But the key was that he had a clear set of what those values were, and we'll return to that. But we talked about the ambiguity of Reith in terms of his own dimension, of his own personal life. But let's be clear, there's a danger in imagining the BBC and other institutions as there being some kind of golden Christian past, and that we have to return to it. That, I don't believe, would be appropriate to say that today. My sense, and I could be wrong in this, is that like others of his generations, Reith simply applied the lens of his faith to the real world as he sought to create a new political institution. And the real world, of course, is ambiguous. And this is pure serendipity, but everything I'm going to account for you now is accurate. On the front of the BBC is a statue created by Eric Gill that comes from the book The Tempest. Does anyone here know who those figures are? I'm just giving it away. Prospero. Ariel. So Prospero and Ariel. And it's interesting why the BBC used that. The power of the air, the spirit of the air. So Ariel, remember, is cast out at the end of chapter 1 by Prospero, the dark magician, to create the chaos that the book The Tempest is named after. And so Ariel is a spirit of the air. And of course, for any sort of, for Reith, he would have been familiar with this. This is the New King James Version of Ephesians 2. And you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. So there's a kind of serendipity, if you like. This is it. If you go on the BBC website, the history of the BBC, it says this: Ariel, as the spirit of the air, was felt to be an appropriate symbol for the new mystery of broadcasting. And we'll come back to that. But you'll also notice that this is the top part of Broadcasting House. What does it look like? Well, it looks like a ship with a prow at the front and a figurehead. Reith imagines in his comments that there are two forces at work in the world that he has to understand and embrace. Now, this is my allegory. The spirit of the power of the air is one force at work, if you like, and there's Christ. No BBC member of staff at Broadcasting House can escape from the oversighting eye of artist Eric Gill's statue of Prospero. Eric Gill himself is a deeply ambiguous, well, worse, was a wicked man. He interestingly thought that he was, when he was asked what inspired you when you carved this, he felt it was the Father and the Son. Eric Gill, in his diaries, it was found later, sexually abused his sister, animals, children. He was a deeply wicked man. But those who know all about the history of statues in Oxford will know that taking down statues and recognising the faults and errors of people who they celebrate or commemorate, the BBC, I think, is going to leave this one alone, but we'll come back to that. So the BBC building was intended to look like a ship. Prospero, 10 feet tall, Ariel both there, and Ariel is depicted, Ariel's master, Prospero, is depicted sending out Ariel into the world. And if you like, a figurehead, there's no figurehead that could better symbolise the tragedy, as Reith might have seen it, of the BBC, and Gill's work in a way kind of explains it. The BBC has near been shipwrecked itself whilst being watched over by this fictional character, Prospero. Tossed about by a raging storm of its own making, it's ironic that the BBC's emblem is Ariel, a spirit who you might see from Shakespeare is linked to the chaos. Prospero used magic arts, abusively manipulated to control people and events. And Ariel, some scholars compared to the spirit of the demons of the air described in Renaissance demonology. Just look him up. And it's thought that that was the source from which Shakespeare had the idea, one possible theory. So in this allegory, Ephesians 2, the devil is the ruler of the authority of the air, or the prince of the air. And that kind of interesting ambiguity is just making an observation. There's no direct link. You can't say that because the historical records, I've been into the BBC library, are not all there. There are no minutes that explain what was in the minds of those people who requested that these statues be made. But there's another part of the story, and I just, in leaving, reference the fact that in some medieval understanding, the prow, the figurehead at the prow of a ship, literally were thought to embody actual spirits. So when a ship sailed, it was thought that you had to have a prow because the spirits were protecting the ship and were in that ship. So there's something kind of slightly spooky about the fact that you've got these characters on the front of the ship. But that's not the whole story. Hidden inside the entrance of Broadcasting House, that Reith was there when it was opened, is another figure also carved by Eric Gill. You hardly ever hear about this character, and that is the sower. And the sower was commissioned. John Reith felt that the sower was relevant. And he also believed that the BBC should have a broadcasting monopoly. The Christian religion, he wrote, and the Sabbath might not have had the place and protection they had, the place and protection which it was right to give them. Why does the Sabbath matter? Well, in Israel, circumcision is a sign of the personal covenant, your membership of Israel as a Jew. Israel, as a covenanted nation, its sign of it being chosen by God is the Sabbath. And so you have circumcision, you have the Sabbath. What Reith was alluding to here was an understanding common at that time that you held Sunday special in law, and remember even King Alfred and thereafter held the Sabbath as important, not just because it was a day of rest and you weren't going to work, but because it was a sign that the nation was under Christ. And so for Reith, it was essential that the Sabbath was in some sense protected by the mission of the BBC, because it was felt to reflect the fact that this was a nation under God, and the broadcasting organisation had to reflect that sense of dynamic relationship. And so we see this figure, the sower soweth the word. And it's clear from the dedication in Latin here that the sower was intended to reference the Gospels. So, you know, from the book of Mark, and the parable of the sower is found in all three synoptic Gospels, is an allegory of Christ. We've got it there at the bottom of the statue, I think. The sower soweth the word. So the question I would throw out to you today for somebody who wants to kind of assess the state of the BBC might be, if you were seeing it from the lens of Reith, which is what I'm trying to do here, he would ask, what is greater? Is it the medium or the message? Is it aerial that matters more in the front of the building, or is it the sower in the heart of the building, the front of the building? Now the Bible has a very clear answer to this in Luke chapter 8 verse 11. It teaches that the word is greater, because Jesus says the seed is the word of God. So Reith and those who commissioned the statue felt that actually what really matters is the BBC as a broadcaster of good stuff, of good seed, of the word of God. And it's a very positive metaphor if we're going to use that language. And the dedication above it also draws from the New Testament. It's Philippians 4 verse 8, if you wondered. It was placed there on the opening of the building in 1932. And you might say that this is the BBC's mission statement. This is the translation. This temple of the arts and muses is dedicated to Almighty God by the first governors of broadcasting. In the year 1931, Sir John Reith being Director General, it's their prayer that good seed sown may bring forth a good harvest, that all things hostile to peace or purity may be banished from this house, and that the people, inclining their ear to whatsoever things are beautiful and honest and of good report, may tread the path of wisdom and uprightness. Reith saw broadcasting as the unique means of bringing, and I'm quoting, an authoritative expression of Christian opinion to the widest public, including the Christian community. So it's about a platform for a Christian worldview. Obviously, we see things differently today. However, that was his intention. You might say, actually, if you examine all of the great institutions of our country, you could go from the founding of the building societies founded by Christians. Today, you might think of the food banks, the modern professional football association clubs founded by Christians as Bible study groups for boys. You know, you can go from everything, from schooling, even the universities. Everything began with a sense of purpose, vocation, and founding values. They were the bedrock of the institutions of the United Kingdom, and it'd be interesting to see how we might understand to restore some of the direction and values, if those were to happen in our institutions, what kind of transformation there would be. Would it offer some of the answers that well be asked? So this was the clear direction of the BBC, to carry into the greatest number of homes everything that was best in every department of human knowledge, endeavour and achievement, and to avoid whatever or was or might be hurtful. So quite high-minded, you might say top down, perhaps even a little arrogant. But going back to Sundays was the idea of broadcasting of what Reith called a straightforward and manly religion. It was for the application of the teaching of Christ to everyday life. This is pretty uncompromising language. The daily service, as part of that vision, began in 1928 and continues to this day. So that sense that worship, the reminder of, as I've said earlier, who's boss, is there in the DNA of the BBC. and continues. You think during the war, there was the pause at night. I think it was 9 p.m. every day for a minute's silence for prayer. It became essential. We'll go on to talk about this as I skim through these final slides. So the BBC, you don't see any values neutrality in the founding purpose of the corporation whatsoever. The Director of Religious Broadcasting, the Reverend James Welsh, wrote in 1939 how Sunday could be used, quotes, for the kingdom of God and a British nation. Those two national Christian initiatives I mentioned, the National Day of Prayer, May 1940, backed by the BBC with George VI as king. The chimes of Big Ben that I mentioned at 9 o'clock. It was a moment of, again I quote, for consecration to the land they love and the success of its cause. So the BBC became a platform, a means of national prayer, of all the people of Britain were to call upon God to protect the land they love and the success of our cause. We see the 1944 Education Act, which mandated religious education for an hour a week. Going back to the Reverend James Welsh, he wanted the BBC to reaffirm the centrality of the Christian faith for the survival of Christian civilization. So national ideals and values stemming from the Christian bedrock values of that era. And the key about it is for Reith and those who shared his vision, they believed that these values transcended any national interest. So they were above any sense that we were promoting a political interest or the interest of the state or of government. He wanted to be independent of money, and he wanted to be independent of the state. So the law remains the same today in relation to the Education Act, and impartiality, again critical to the DNA of the BBC, remains a key BBC concept, but it was not impartial on faith. When Reith was succeeded by the new Director General in 1944, Sir William Hayley stated the BBC saw its role as defending Christian values and to foster acceptance of them. Again, I quote, "The whole preponderant weight of its programmes is directed towards this end." So Reith and Hayley believe the aims of religious broadcasting, again I quote, were to make Britain a more Christian country. So he went further. We have some idea that the notion of a board of running any public corporation or company or privately quoted company, you'll be familiar with the idea of a board of management, an executive committee, and then a separate set of trustees or governors. We tend to think of that as so commonplace today, we don't realise how new it was to corporate law. Again, quoting from the history of the BBC, we see that Christian corporatism, as I've called it, was originated with some of the ideas of John Reith. And you see from the BBC website, his belief in public service broadcasting led him to propose what was an innovation to the running of the state. So he came up with the idea of a public corporation, again, independent of government, but supervised by a board of governors. So it's still run by managers, but the governors are there to put the public interest first. I'll just throw out to you an observation that I might have, that I've got. I can't evidence it in Reith's writings, but you would be familiar that in the Exodus of Moses and Aaron, Moses was, if you like, the leader of Israel as they escaped from the captivity of Egypt, but Aaron and the Levitical priesthood as they emerged were the prophetic line, if you like. I live in Kingston, and the deal that we have today with bishops in the House of Lords was originated at the Great Ecclesiastical Council of 838, where the line of Saxon kings made a deal with the bishops. You recognise us and our heirs, and we'll recognise your right to speak truth to power. So you can play the role, if you like, of the Aaronic priesthood, and the kings will be under God, there will be the Moses figure. And so I just throw it out to you, was in the mind of Reith, was he thinking in terms of the governance, that he was the executive, the Director General, doing the role of Moses, applying the law of God, and the Board of Governors were the Aaronic Levitical priesthood adding their bit of wisdom. I'm just throwing that out, that I think, because remember this idea originated with Reith, he took it onto BOAC, he went on after the BBC into setting up another major public corporation, and in fact all the big public corporations through the 50s, 60s, 70s were governed on similar basis. So independence of the state was pretty critical. I'm going to rush through now. During the General Strike of 26, Churchill would have loved the BBC to propagate his position. Churchill thought the BBC should be a government mouthpiece, and Reith wrote, if he was to concede that, it would have been better for me, worse for the BBC and for the country, meaning he would do himself a favour if he caved into that, but he wasn't about to cave into that. And he wrote, the Archbishop of Canterbury thought, we're going to end the national strike, I'm going to go onto the national airwaves and appeal for an end. He was going to become political. And Reith said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. So it wasn't about privileging the church as the established faith. For him, it was more important to do the right thing and for him to interpret that what that was. And if that meant that the BBC should be independent, then it meant saying no to the Archbishop. But it did allow the reporting of the Trade Union Congress statements. So he thought that that was a public interest matter. And it's a bit more complicated than that, but I want to speed on now. So we see then that the BBC became, in its founding, a means of sharing the Christian faith. So there was yet another new head of religious broadcasting. You'll get the sense here that this role or position mattered, the Reverend Francis House. He stated there were 4 aspects of this in 1945. So we're talking about rebuilding Britain, if you like. The BBC had a critical role. Remember Dimbleby at the gates of the concentration camps reporting. There were other war reporters at the D-Day landings. The BBC really came into its own, reporting what was going out in the world. So the BBC really became established in the minds of its audiences. And its leaders said, well, we're going to rebuild Britain, this new Britain of Beveridge, of William Temple, of Attlee's radical 1945 government, motivated by the writings of people like R.H. Tawney and Temple. And so they saw the Christian dimension as essential. And he said this, the objective was to make Britain, quotes, more Christian. Standards of truth, justice and honesty in private and public life. Boy, we could do with a bit of that today. To explain what the Christian faith is. To lead non-churchgoers to see that any real Christian commitment involves active membership of an actual church. And lastly, to provide opportunities for that challenge to personal faith in Jesus Christ as Saviour and Lord, which is at the heart of conversion. And this is Peter Dimmock and the Reverend Francis House talking here in Westminster Abbey. So his report stated that the 4th, i.e. conversion, must never be omitted. So the BBC was essentially to be a pulpit, to call the unregenerate to faith, if you like. So a very clear perspective. So they announced a review in 48, where we'll re-examine all our programmes to see how they could become more efficiently evangelistic. I mean, this is mind-boggling. Yeah. It's a hidden history, by the way. You will not see this. You will not hear anyone talk about this other than in Pusey House. Just make sure you're here next week. So I began to think, with the BBC under relentless attack, if you want to know what the consequences of breaking the covenant are, I'm not going to detail them today, but they're in chapter 25, I think, and 26 of Leviticus. The promises of the covenant. Who is going to avenge the quarrel of the covenant? You'll see, and in Reithian terms. And I thought, well, there's always opportunity to renew the covenant. Every time that Israel was apostate, they leaned to the temple. They leaned on the pillars of the temple and swore to renew the covenant. They read the books of the law and agreed to renew it. So I thought, I was reading some of this stuff and I thought, well, I'm not going to write with my NUJ hat on, although they knew who I was. So I thought, I'm going to write to the Director General, the Chairman of the BBC, who was Lord Patton, because the BBC built this, you'll see the picture here at the back, this 1.2 billion new building, new broadcasting house, and it moved its executive offices from old broadcasting house, from the ship to this thing at the back. And I thought, well, they're going to have a dedication. And so I thought, so I wrote to Lord Patton. I said, dear Lord Patton, well, I've got this terrific idea. When the Queen comes to open the building, this was in 2013, why don't you, I've got a verse for you. And, you can engrave it on the outside. And the verse is from Haggai 2, verse 9. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts, and in this place will I give peace. Lord Patton wrote that. Terrific. One of the funniest answers I think I've ever read from somebody in a position of authority. He wrote back in his email to me, he said, matters to do with the fabric of the building are not a matter for the chairman of the BBC. The fabric of the building is entirely a matter for the Director General. So I, don't trouble me with this nonsense. So I wrote to Lord Hall, and I said, come on, Lord Hall, let's get Queen Elizabeth to dedicate the building to being a place of peace. And he wrote back, or rather one of his minions, he himself would, you can just imagine whoever was the retired Sir Humphrey working in his office. In 2013, a multi-faith BBC in UK feels slightly inappropriate to dedicate the building solely via a Christian dedication. So we'll certainly look at a way of marking this important moment. You'll know when anybody writes in an email, so we'll certainly look at a way, for absolutely sure that there's no intention of doing anything like that. They'll glance in the direction of it and quickly move on, whilst drawing in wider face. So do you imagine that the BBC would have invited an imam, a rabbi, do you imagine any Roman Catholic bishop? Absolutely no. So when the Queen came, I think this was it. I think there was a little, if we kind of zoom in, I can't really zoom in. There's Chris Patton, there's Queen Elizabeth, and there was some kind of little plaque. There may have been a bit of champagne smashed at the time. So there we have it. But at the same time, 2012, out of this chaos of the BBC, under relentless attack from government during the years of austerity of the 2010 government, the BBC licence fee was frozen, £500 million of cost of the World Service was dumped onto the backs of licence fee payers, huge cuts, loss of hundreds of jobs. I took the BBC staff out on strike in opposition to that, and in protection of our pensions and pay. And at that time, you had all these errors that you'll be familiar with, BBC broadcasting things that were just factually not true. And then you had the Jimmy Savile affair, where Savile got away with abusing people in plain sight, very likely hundreds, if not 1,000 people. At the same time, as a review afterwards, the BBC did a review into bullying and sexual harassment of staff. And I was the chairman of the London branch at the time, and Dinah Rose QC led the review into the BBC of the culture of harassment and bullying. And over 1,000 members of staff and former members of staff wrote into that review or joined in discussion meetings about the culture of bullying and harassment. The spirit of control. The spirit of control. And sexualized behavior, the chaos, the spirit of the air, the darkness. So you could see if Reith was here today, he would begin to kind of have insights about that. And I had to represent, I didn't have to, I chose to, and it was a really distressing moment to hear the testimony of women in the BBC who were bullied, sexually assaulted, even the men. I mean, we'll talk about it afterwards, but some of the stories that I was told, and the culture of denial in the BBC at the highest levels that this was happening. I went to one boss, I wasn't intending to share this, but I'm going to, and they were so scared, a group of 24 people in the newsroom, by a boss who was assaulting them. They were so scared they didn't want to make a complaint, but out of 24, 6 said they were willing to, but as long as they didn't print their names. They didn't even want to, they emailed me anonymously their details, just as long as I took out their gender, and as long as I copied and pasted into a new sheet of paper. And I went to a BBC boss, I'm not going to say who it was, and I handed this list of accusations, and he said, homophobic abuse, physically assaulting somebody in the newsroom, misogyny, I don't want this person to work for me if they're going to become pregnant, theft, drunkenness, what do you want me to do? And I said, I want this manager immediately suspended pending a full investigation. His reply was, there's nothing here that would merit that.
Oh, yeah.
Denial, a spirit of control, a culture of abuse. And it had to be transformed and challenged and changed. I just show this. Really, really odd. I hadn't realised this would get this dramatic. This is Ariel. you have Ariel or you have the Prince of Peace. A few months ago, January this year, this was a photograph of a man who was arrested for attacking Ariel's penis. Really, and taking a hammer to the sculpture. So we didn't know this was going to happen when I kind of riffed on this theme in Warsaw. But I wasn't really amazed when people took some of this stuff quite literally and saw this as symbolising something about the corporation that they had discerned and detected. And I'm hesitant to draw any conclusions because this is, as I said, all speculative, coincidental, or is it? Thankfully, the BBC has committed itself to a reformation of this culture. They've made it their first and top priority. There was a review, the Pollard Review, into the failures that happened at Newsnight, a programme I once worked on. They damningly found that leadership and organisation seemed to be in short supply at the BBC. This is what happened. This assault is beyond bizarre, and I don't really know how to interpret it. Interestingly, though, in the new building, this is the management floor. So it moved from old broadcasting house into a new third floor. And just before I left, I thought I'm just going to take a couple of snaps. So what we see is something that's slightly curious here. The Spectator some years ago wrote this under John Burt, another Director General. The BBC, he was Director General from 1999. An ever-increasing number of new structures, controls, and governance were imposed upon the BBC's creative talents to suppress and remove risk. So there's been this drive to compliance, because if you don't have vision and values, Reith might have argued, or a foundation or an anchor, all you've got left is the law. You've got grace or the law. The law kills, if you are familiar with that New Testament sense. The letter killeth, but the Spirit gives life. And guess what is, so there's 2 meeting rooms inside this management block where the chairman and the director general all have their secretariat. And every single room in New Broadcasting House is named after people like Harry Seacombe, the Attenboroughs, famous characters from BBC comedies. But the 2 rooms in the management block, who are they named after? It's really easy. Who are they named after? Anyone want to give a No, not bad, but it's really easy. One is named Prospero and the other is named Ariel. This is the room that's actually Ariel's room, because I've actually shown you the answer there. There used to be open glass plated open offices, but sort of enclosed. They're now covered up. There's an allegory if you want. So Ariel and Prospero are the 2 covered up rooms where the BBC take their decisions. I'm not drawing, I don't know really what I'm saying here. I'm just making an observation. I'm just reporting, I'm doing what the BBC is supposed to do, just report the facts. It's up to you to interpret them, as they say. But there's something about the facts that we might select. We're running out of time and just coming up to the end. So more laws and layers, if you like. 2016, the Royal Charter scrapped that difference between the trustees or the governors and the management executive. For the first time in the history of the BBC, government-appointed governors are now sitting on the unified mandatory board. That's never happened in the history of the BBC. So that would have turned Reith in this grave. The idea that political appointed people have a direct say on editorial content. Ofcom has now got oversight of BBC editorial content. Financial decisions by the National Audit Office. Continual cuts in the licence fee. So a quarter of the licensing revenue has been diverted or cut. The single biggest cost of the BBC after the cost of BBC One are free licence fees for over 75s. So 20% of the licence fee is being devoted for a welfare policy until the BBC capped it. So instead of making programmes, it goes into welfare policy, but yet more sort of financial pressure, reaping what some, Reith would have laughed and said, you're reaping what you sow. Interestingly, that other Reithian principle is also changing. So the BBC now is reliant on commercial revenues and putting a lot of what it does into the private sector. And this year, the BBC was frozen yet again. This was after a BBC presenter on the Today programme, another unit man, told Boris Johnson to stop talking. The most expensive interview that the BBC has ever had. So where are we with the BBC today? So the BBC is now, this is just in the last few weeks, the BBC is now subject to an entirely new principle. This is the Director General. We hear those comments about impartiality, but without saying how they're going to deliver it, because there's no anchor for the values by which you view the world. You're just saying you're impartial. I invite you to reflect on that. But it's now going to have to build on commercial income. These are the priorities. And then in the white paper published, I think, last week or the week before, the government will support the BBC in diversifying its income streams, becoming more commercially successful and less reliant on licence fee. So instead of this idea that the BBC is owned by the public with a sense of purpose and public vision, the moment you cut yourself off from the values, what is it that you're distinctive about? What is it that you're doing? Reith would have perhaps have argued. So I'm projecting onto him things that I suspect he may have said, and you will have to interpret how much of that is my views and how much of that is genuinely his. But I conclude by saying, at the core of I guess, this observation of the quick run-through of the history of the corporation, I'm not saying anything about it's some of it, what it does. I still think the BBC is a brilliant place, essential to Britain's reputation internationally. I still believe it's speaking peace and truth, internationally. But I was really struck by the idea of what happens when Christianity disappears from the public space. And this was from The Guardian. And I wrote it down May 27th because I thought it's still relevant. The idea that people have some rights just because they're human and entirely irrespective of merit certainly isn't derived from observation of the world. It arose out of Christianity. No matter how much Christians have in practice resisted it, although human rights have become embedded in our institutions, at the same time as religious observance has been in decline, they could become vulnerable in an entirely post-Christian environment where the collective memory slips from the old moorings inherited from Christian ethics. Now, The Guardian interprets all of this away from the language of covenant, of promise, and the idea that there is a God who holds to covenant, so it wants to have a relationship. Remember, the covenantal model at its heart is the idea that we are made in his image, that God wants the created order and in human institutions to be in relationship with him. So The Guardian draws that out into second order ethics, but the point remains the same. If we lose the vision and the values, the whole basis and the case for the institution diminishes, and you're almost in a Romans 1 situation where, if those who are familiar with that chapter, where God gives over. There's a sense of giving over. Has the BBC, Reith may have asked, has the BBC been given over to the consequences of its refusal to acknowledge the sower of the seed? Thank you very much.